And hello, everyone. Hello, hello. Right.
Hello.
So, hello. So, this week we're going to be talking about medically difficult charts and medical astrology. And this was really something I think that you said a few episodes ago, Ollie, about when the chart is flashing red. And you were talking about really when we see a client and we have a consultation chart, a chart for the time of that consultation, and the chart is full of suggestions that things may be tricky with this client's medical situation or with the interaction or something. So I thought it'd be an interesting one to do a bit of retrospective where we're looking at those sorts of charts. So did you
Definitely.
want to start off with a chart, or shall I do
I think
one
you
of mine?
started to, maybe it's useful just to run through a few pointers of what sort of things we'd be looking
Oh,
for.
great. Yeah,
The
yeah.
very
Okay.
basic sort of
Shoot.
thing for launching straight into the chart.
Yes.
You jump in here too. I
Cool.
suppose for me, the first thing I would look at is the positions of the ruling planets of the sixth and eighth house, and to a lesser extent, the 12th house. To see if they're obviously if like the eighth house ruler is in the sixth house or the sixth house ruler in the eighth house, that it's not a red flag per se, but it's something you definitely should then start looking deeper and like, ooh,
Yes,
that's
yes,
interesting.
definitely. Just to unpack that for our readers who readers, listeners, watchers,
Listeners.
listeners. That's the word. Yes, well done. Good. Okay. Who are not fluent in astrologies or maybe just beginning. The sixth house is the house of illness. It's the part of the chart which represents illness. So the ruler of the sixth house means the planet that rules the sign on the cusp of the sixth house, and the eighth house is the part of the chart that can represent at its worst death. That is one of its main meanings, but therefore also chronic illnesses. In other words, things which are with you until you die. So you don't want the ruler of the sixth house of illness in the eighth. That could be an illness which is potentially terminal or maybe with you until you die, or the ruler of the eighth house in the sixth. There's
Yes.
same sort of thing, vice versa. Yeah.
And yeah, and to a less extent, the 12th house ruler, which is traditionally the house of secret enemies, but is also
Mm.
like the house of stuff you don't know and isolation and things, is another one to look at, as it's not a good, it's a planetary ruler of that. It, again, in the sixth might
Yeah,
indicate,
exactly. It's stuff. It's sort of the 12th house is the place of prison traditionally. So it ruled things which trap you in your life, or which may be sort of undermining you in some way. So it's often the house of vices or addictions or
yes.
behaviors that undermine your health. And in medical context, it can often indicate mental health problems as well. I've found. So yeah.
And the last one, which again, I've read this, but it seems always less obvious to me, is the fourth house, which is the house of, it's a house of a home, but it can be read as a
Mm.
house of endings as well, as it's
Yes,
the
it's
bottom
a
of the
sort of
chart.
alternate house of death, isn't it, in a
Yeah,
way, because it represents the grave. It's the
yeah.
lowest point of the chart. So yeah, by no means is it um, as kind of concerning as the eighth house could be, but it is. I'd agree with that.
Particularly those interactions, the eighth house ruler in the fourth house would not be a terribly good sign, would it? And
No,
if they're
no,
ruler in
no,
the fourth
exactly.
house.
This disease could end in death. I mean,
Yeah,
these are all individual. So we're doing very cookbook things
yeah,
here to look out
absolutely.
for.
Yeah. It's just useful things, and then you can go into detail. And in fact, if you read your Culpepper, he has 1,000 reasons to
Oh
say why
yeah,
this is
he's got a
not the case.
chapter on this, like signs of death, signs of life, signs of recovery, signs of worsening.
Yeah,
So there are little chapters on all of those things, so that you've got whole lists of things. So we're just going to cherry pick a few of our
yeah.
favorites, if you like, favorites, as if this is a favorite thing. But so other things that concern me, if you see quote unquote malefics, air quotes malefics on the angles.
Yeah.
So that traditionally means Saturn and Mars because they're challenging planets. So usually when you have those planets on angles, they can indicate, because Mars is inflammatory, infectious, cutting, burning, accidents. Saturn is very aging, it's chilling, it kind of wears people down. But obviously that's very modifiable by context. If either of those planets rule the sign that is rising, rule the ascendant, basically, then that could, and particularly if they're strong, that could mean that the person has a great deal of agency in the situation and is actually a good sign.
Yeah.
So it's very modified. But if you see a malefic, particularly that rules one of those slightly dodgy houses that we've been talking about, the 6th, the 8th, or the 12th on an angle, that's usually not great. Or if you see either of the luminaries, the sun or moon, in hard aspect to a malefic.
Yes.
So in a square or a trine or a conjunction. So that just means together with, 90 degrees from, or 180 degrees from. That's usually not great. It's not necessarily a flashing red. It's just like this is a challenging situation. Yeah. But I really like the one you said, Ollie, where interchanges between the 6th and 8th, and also the 1st and 8th,
yeah.
or 1st and 6th. But particularly, so the ascendant ruler and the first, when I say the first, I mean the ascendant, the eastern horizon, the first house, the ruler of that house, the ruler of the ascendant, same thing, being placed in the 8th or in the 6th, it may not be a great sign.
Yeah,
for similar reasons.
The ascendant is the patient, the body of the patient particularly,
yes.
and basically that being the patient is in the house of disease or in the house of death, which is not ideal.
Exactly. And then, per what we were talking about in our last episode, the ascendant ruler combust, so too close to the sun, being burned up, particularly if it's in a naughty house. If it's combust in the 8th or the 6th or the 12th, that could be a dodgy sign. And there are loads. I mean, there's loads.
And what about the via negativa as well? Is that how seriously?
Via combusta.
Combusta, sorry, yes.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. So the via combusta is an area of the zodiac between 15 Libra, tropical sign 15 Libra, and 15 Scorpio. I look at the moon in that sign. I don't pay that much attention to it, actually.
Okay.
I just, usually it means that the person is emotionally distressed.
Okay.
And things are rather turbulent for them. And the moon also being a physical sign, it can mean so particularly if the moon is towards the end of Libra and about to enter Scorpio, that means the moon's about to enter its sign of fall, because traditionally the moon doesn't like being in Scorpio.
Yeah.
So it usually means the person is emotionally distressed or troubled, and there's about to be some turn for the worse or some appearance of some sign. But again, all of this can be mitigated by context. Let's say the ascendant ruler is Mars, and the moon, and Mars is in Pisces or something,
right?
And the moon is about to enter Scorpio and trine Mars, the ascendant ruler. Great, because in that circumstance you'd have the moon entering a sign ruled by Mars, applying by friendly aspect to the ascendant ruler. That usually brings improvement. So all of these little conditions that we've listed so far are all with the caveat, all else being equal. In other words, if taken in isolation, these things would be negative indications, and broadly speaking are, but you have to, there may be other things in the chart which surmount that or negate or mitigate them.
Yes, because now, oh God, this has popped out of my head. Sorry. You carry on, Marco, because there was something I was thinking of, which was another sort of. No, you say what.
So I'll say some more stuff, and then it'll wander back in. Yeah. So okay. So what's another one that I would sometimes look at? I've talked about hard aspects to the sun and moon, particularly from the
I've
north
remembered, Marcos, if you want me to.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah. I've got one more as well.
Fixed stars, which I do look at a few.
Yes.
There's things like algol, which you don't want really the ascendant planetary ruler to be. There's certain fixed stars are fixed because they do move very slowly across the heavens, but not so we can see them.
Yes.
And so they're basically the stars which aren't the actual stars up in the sky, mainly the ones that are on the line, the ecliptic, which the sun passes along. And some of those are very, very bad. Some are very good, but we're talking badness. And for instance, now, God, sorry, my memory shot. Where's Algol at the moment? It's Taurus.
So Algol's 26 Taurus, 26 approximately.
Taurus, that's right.
And then some other ones that I often think of are Shiat is what it sounds like, 29 Pisces. To some degree, what Antares probably 10 degrees Sag. Scapulus is a bit dodge, isn't it? And
Bit
fascias
dodgy, yes, yes. It's
to a
not
lesser degree, but certainly Algol's the biggie. Shiat is pretty nasty. Antares can bring fever and intense situations. There are a few others like the South Scalar, Zuben El Ganubai,
yes.
that about 15 degrees
And the
Scorpio.
thing about fixed stars, we're really only looking at very tight conjunctions with them, so they don't come up
Yeah,
that much. But you know, I actually did
but
have a
when they're sitting there, when yes,
yeah, and I did have a patient who had their ascendant like pretty much bang on alcohol. It's like, okay, that's not
interesting.
ideal. And that sort of thing, you think I'll take a closer look at the other stuff, sort of thing.
Yes, definitely. Because I think John Frawley said in one of his books, like a fixed star on an angle, it's kind of like it gives you the title of the book.
Right.
It's sort of like a cover story because and certainly in traditional astrology, the fixed star, I think Lily said the fixed stars have the power to elevate a nativity or depress it way beyond anything. So in other words, if you've got this fixed star on an angle, the whole nativity might be really bad, but you've got this amazing fixed star on an angle. You can get, I think Lilly put it with his usual colorful turn of phrase, 16th century English. He said, it can elevate them even from the dunghill. But if the rest of the chart does not so well support it, they will be cast down again with a vengeance. So it's just like the stars, the fixed stars have this power to really do far more than the planets will. But if the rest of the chart isn't saying the same thing, then they won't last forever. So
Right.
if you've got a dodgy fixed star and an angle, but the rest of the chart's pretty good, you're going to have some dodgy thing. And in medical terms, that may be an inflammatory condition or a sudden illness or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, Michael, well, let's talk about your chart now, and let's
Okay, there's one
reflect on
more
these
point I wanted
zones.
to
Oh,
throw
one
in, and that
more.
was
Okay.
the point about just very briefly essential dignity
Oh, yeah.
of the ascendant ruler and the moon, which is just to say if that planet is it, particularly in the sign of its fall, all the planets have signs where they enjoy being in, which are typically known as their houses, their domiciles, or their exaltations, and they have signs where they don't enjoy being in, which is their detriments, which is opposite to their houses or their domiciles, and their fall, which is opposite to the sign of their exaltation. And being placed in those signs can often mean the person is struggling or depressed. And again, if you really if you see that together with the planet with some of the other conditions that we talked about, like maybe that planet is in the 6th house or the 8th house or the 12th house, as well as or as you know, it could be
Yeah.
in a good house, but it's opposed to Saturn or something like that. So there's a bunch of things. But anyway, so we could go on, but I'll get my chart up. So I'll just share my screen. This was a consultation chart from a couple of years ago. And this was a chart that now bear in mind what we always say, astrology being a context dependent art. So it really depends on the context, but I think you can see from this chart, this is not a very salutary chart. So why do I say that? Firstly, we have the rising sign is Scorpio here, 1 degree Scorpio rising, and we have the ruler of that rising sign, the ruler of the 1st house or the ascendant is Mars here in the opposite sign in Taurus. So that's Mars in its detriment. And it's a daytime chart because the sun's above the horizon. So Mars is also out of sect in this chart. But what that means is certain planets enjoy being in daytime charts and certain planets enjoy being in nighttime charts. Mars, ironically, is a very traditionally hot, dry planet, actually prefers the nighttime because the nighttime cools Mars down. Mars can only make friends when he's not quite as incendiary. So Mars prefers being in nighttime charts. And when planets traditionally were said to be out of sect, so Mars in a daytime chart would be said to be out of sect. I kind of think of them as being, they are less conscious. They're less able to control what happens to them. They're less aware of what they're doing and therefore less able to steer their ship. So this is a Mars that is more inflammatory than he should be in a sign which represents disintegration. Mars in Taurus is in detriment, and we can be a lot more black and white about these event charts than we would. If this was a birth chart, there would be more room for nuance because the chart would unfold all of its potentials over a longer period of time, and you could find some constructive expressions for that Mars as well. But in a limited medical scenario, that might indicate difficulties. So that's number one. Yes, Mars is angular. It's right on the 7th cusp, but that's So that may indicate a degree of control, but it's opposing the ascendant, which is not traditionally good. We have Mars is also the ruler of the sixth house of illness. So typically when Scorpio rises, it's often the case that the patients may drive their illnesses on a bit. And I would say this is definitely going to be the case when you have that Mars ruling the first, opposing the first house. So if that Mars had been placed in, say, Leo in the 10th, then it might have been, okay, some of what they're going to be doing is going to be to improve their health with effort, because Leo is squaring Scorpio, and it would be trining the sixth house of illness. So to some extent, they'd be driving their own illness, but they'd be able to see both conditions and have some control over them. Here, Mars has some control over the ascendant, so he's trying to look after his or her health, but is in detriment and literally opposing his or her own health. And because it's out of sect, it's less conscious of what it's doing. So that's number one, still on indication number one. Second indication that made me a bit concerned was we have this retrograde Saturn in the fourth house. The fourth house being, as you were talking about, Ollie, the house of endings of things. And typically Saturn retrograde, even in good dignity, as in Aquarius, and Saturn is better in daytime charts, all else being equal, because Saturn is too cold and the day warms Saturn up, makes him a bit more flexy than he otherwise would be, which is good. But Saturn's retrograde, and retrograde tends to undo things or make them drag backwards. So you've got this difficult planet, Saturn, retrograde in the fourth house of ending. The third thing I didn't like was basically where things were going. So what I do for this is I look at the ascendant ruler, Mars, and then secondly, the moon as another indication of the patient. I work with whichever of them, this is a bit of a complicated concept to people who are non-astrologers, but I work with whichever of them beholds the ascendant or sees the ascendant. So what that means is it has to be either in the same sign or in the opposite sign, or in the signs 90 degrees from, or 120 or 60 degrees from. It can't be in the sign either side from the rising sign, or it can't be in either of the signs which are 150 degrees away from the rising sign. So Mars here beholds the ascendant. Mars is in a position to at least try to support their own health. It's just a lot of what they do, as we've already discussed, might undermine it. So I'll work with Mars and I'll just move Mars forward and I'll see where Mars goes. And I think you can see where he probably ends up here. But basically, Mars just grinds forward through Taurus and comes to the square of Saturn. So if something else got to Saturn before Mars, and ideally that something else would be Jupiter, because in the traditional planetary order, Jupiter is the only planet with more authority than Mars, other than Saturn. That would be called an abscission of light. That would mean something else might prevent Mars completing that square to Saturn, but nothing did. So basically, in terms of prognosis, this person is just heading towards that square of Mars. I think Venus gets there first. So Venus, you can see at 17 Gemini, does throw a trine to Saturn, and Venus rules Mars. So Venus has some power over Mars, but Venus is placed in the 8th house, which is not a very strong position. And Venus has less authority, I would say, than Mars, although Mars is to some degree answerable to Venus. In this chart, Venus rules Taurus, the 7th house. So I took Venus to be the physician, i.e. me, or the therapist. I'm not a physician, I'm a herbalist, but the therapist. So the therapist may have some power over that disease process, but I would say that there's nothing really blocking. I'd say that Venus trining Saturn first is more of it's a bit of a, it can, I don't think Venus will fully prohibit that aspect, is what I'm saying. The second thing which is more positive is that the moon is in the 12th house, which is not a good sign, as what you were saying, Ollie, but the moon is applying to trine Saturn. That's not bad, because the moon is in Libra, and Saturn likes Libra, so the moon will receive Saturn from Libra. But given that the moon is in the 12th house, which is already discussed, is not a great house, and Saturn is retrograde, I'd take that received trine to Saturn retrograde to mean maybe not getting worse or not as bad as it could be. Do you know what I mean? But it's not great. And then the final thing would be, I looked at the 10th house of medicine. You've got Leo on the cusp, the sun in Cancer, not very strong. That's not wholly bad, because the sun does the Cancer is in trine to the ascendant, but it's in a quite weak house. The ninth house is not very strong. It's a good house for the sun, but it's not very strong. And it's also in the fall of the ascendant ruler. Cancer is the sign in which Mars, the ascendant ruler, has his fall. So to me, that indicates medicines which may do some good, but also are maybe that there's something objectionable about them to the patient in some way, you know?
Right.
So yeah, it's not all bad, but it's not a great chart, and particularly if you wound it forward. So the positives I took from this chart were that, okay, that the practitioner maybe has a little bit of power to modify the disease process a bit and maybe forestall it. And there may be some plateauing before this patient gets worse. But this was a chart that I thought was pretty dire. Now, the context is what makes this. If this had been a person with a cold, I would have thought, okay, this will drag on a bit, and the practitioner, you might be able to suggest some things that will make them feel a bit better, but they probably won't stick, and then it will just get a bit nasty and they'll get snotty and they'll get rid of it. This was a client who came in who had terminal cancer diagnosis, stomach cancer, which made me think the stomach is the fourth house.
Yeah.
So I looked at that retrograde Saturn. Saturn is one of the major planetary significators of cancer, because cancer often involves wasting and pain and hard masses and shrinkage of tissue, as in it's a growth, but the tissue around it changes. So cachexia is one of the old words, loss of weight. And so anyway, so they got a terminal diagnosis, they had stomach cancer, and they had had lots of surgery and chemotherapy, and they were coming to me as a sort of like last gasp, last ditch attempt at something kind of thing. So given that context, I was not hugely encouraged by this chart. Is there anything else you've noticed from this chart, Ollie? Because I mean, I can go on and tell you what happened with it, but I'm just gonna.
Yeah, I mean, because the Saturn in the Mars in Taurus, yeah, that can also indicate the sort of viscera canted as well, but by moving. I mean, nothing. I mean, it just looks like, because the ruler of the 12th and the ruler of the 8th are both in the 8th house, because they're both Venus, which isn't a very good sign.
Yes.
So yeah, it's all like
that's also not a good sign, folks. When you see the rule of the 7th house, which is the house of the physician or therapist, ruling the 8th house, which is the house of death, and the 12th house of hidden enemies or undermining, it can indicate that the physician says or does things which are undermining to the patient, or may actually speed up their death at worst. Also, finding a malefic, a difficult planet in the 7th could indicate similar things. Now, Venus, the 7th ruler, and that's obviously not a nice thing to hear, but I've done many consultation charts, and you see yourself reflected in the situation of each chart very differently. I'm sure you've seen the same, Ollie, where in some charts you're represented by a very strong 7th ruler, and it shows you doing amazing things for the patient. This was not a chart where I did amazing things for the patient, as I'll tell you. Venus, the 7th ruler, is not totally without power, as I've said. Like Venus in that degree of Gemini, 17 Gemini, is in her term, so she has some dignity, and is receiving the Mars, the ruler of the 6th and 1st. So it's like Venus does have some power over the illness and does have some capacity, but being in the 8th, there's not a lot. It's more like Venus's ability here is limited to a partial ability to palliate the course of the disease. That's how I interpreted it.
And which is a great Venetian trait anyway, sort of thing. So
exactly, just because the 8th house tends to limit any of those weak houses. The 8th, the 6th, or the 12th tends to limit the capacity of the planet to do good, and it's any good planets in those houses are really turned more into alleviating harm rather than add it. They're more returning to zero rather than net positive.
And out of interest, Marcus, was the patient in and out of hospital a lot? I'm just interested with the moon in the 12th and
No,
also
they were in and out. They'd been in hospital,
right,
and they had
okay.
frequent hospital appointments too. And this is where the moon they had a lot of lymphedema, a lot
Ah,
of
right,
collection of fluid in their lower legs. And as we know,
right.
Aquarius rules the ankles. The
Yes,
12th
yes,
house is one
yeah,
of the places that rules the feet. So you had the moon in the 12th, lots of swelling, collection of fluid in the feet. And so you could see the Saturn in Aquarius in the fourth. Okay, they had a tumor in the stomach, the fourth house, but they also had, presumably as a result of metastasis, a lot of blockages in the lymphatic drainage from their lower limbs. And in fact, what happened when that moon went to that trine of Saturn, which I was kind of counting on to bring a measure of relief, actually the swelling in their feet just got worse. But
right,
then they went into hospital to have it drained
right,
again.
yeah.
So that was the 12th house. The 12th house can be a signification of hospital.
What was the outcome? How did it match
Well,
up?
I mean, she the very nice lady. She died eventually, but and I thought maybe we could get it in the best case scenario. I'd hoped for, because you've got Mars in a fixed sign, which can indicate long units of time, in an angle which can indicate long units of time. I thought maybe Mars moved to that square of Saturn. So from 1 degree of Taurus, it only completed the square at 22. So I thought, well, possibly we might get 20 years out of this person, or 20 months. But actually, I think she passed away in sort of, oh, this is, oh, I think it was less than that, a lot less than that. It passed away about 6 months later, so it wasn't a long time at all. Um,
More
and
like
I
20 weeks
think
sort of thing,
so. In
yeah.
terms of what happened, you could see me as this Venus. Some of the things I suggested were helpful, but the prescription I tried to give was way too complicated. This is something that I'm learning more and more. When I see people who have had, like, been really through the wars, and particularly if they've got a terminal diagnosis, or they've been through cancer treatment, and they're very delicate. So you want to go in with a prescription that's really light and really gentle, maybe just one or two herbs to start with, see how that's tolerated, and then you can add to it. I went in with a much too complicated prescription to start with, which just made them throw up immediately. So you can see there the sun, the midheaven ruler in the fall of the ascendant ruler. Literally, the prescription was rejected by the patient,
Right,
which is
yes.
what happens when it's an opposite of reception. And the sun is in the fall of Mars. Mars will literally reject that medicine. So it wasn't good for them. Was it wholly bad? No, the sun is in the sign that trines the ascendant. It's got what I call a generosity with Jupiter on the cusp of the sixth house. Jupiter's this planet in Aries on the cusp of the sixth. Jupiter's in Aries, which is the sign of the sun's exaltation. The sun is in Cancer, which is the sign of Jupiter's exaltation. So Jupiter in this chart rules the liver, rules the fifth house. And so the medicine would have been somewhat good for the liver and somewhat supportive. But what did end up happening was that the patient's daughter, who was the fifth house, you can see is ruled by that Jupiter, was, I think, the most helpful person to them. And actually gave them a lot of support. And the daughter put her, I'd suggested, I think, some milk thistle, which the daughter put her on, and she found that very helpful. But the daughter actually put her on ginseng, which turned out to be quite helpful for her quality of life. I didn't. I'd tried some other adaptogen in the tincture, which had been ejected by the patient. I'd suggested milk thistle, which did help her, and then the daughter put her on ginseng, which helped a bit,
And of course, so
just to
we'd
improve her
probably
quality of life.
say Korean Panax, Korean ginseng is probably a martial herb, I would say.
I think it's a herb of the sun, actually, interestingly.
Interesting. So I always wonder because it's quite pokey. So, I mean,
It is, but it's got a sweetish flavor. It's life enhancing. It's not toxic or bitter, or it
it
does
does
not
have red berries,
spiky.
doesn't it? I mean, anyway, one could go on and
No,
on.
and Sun and Mars can be interchanged for one another to some
Indeed,
degree. But
indeed.
yeah, I thought that was a beneficial herb of the sun. but we don't actually know what planet
No.
rules ginseng. My guess has always been it's Sun in Sagittarius, but we don't actually know. But the ginseng certainly helped a bit. I think probably in retrospect, if I'd gone back to this chart, I might have just gone in with something a lot more gentle, like maybe some ginger tea for nausea, some fresh
Right.
ginger
Yes.
tea, maybe some milk thistle to support the liver, and then perhaps something like ginseng or a simple adaptogen. And then I'd have probably added in, if that was well tolerated, and this is the value. I mean, all this is basically ambulance chasing when you're going back over things and thinking, what would I have done? But this is why they call it practicing, folks, because you learn as you go through and you start to see. And I think although astrology tends to work out as the chart shows you it can, I'm not a fatalist. I don't think any of this is fated. So the fact that here, the leverage here is that Venus does have some power over that Mars and does get to Saturn before Mars does. So to me, Venus, however limited its power, it does have this power to palliate. And interestingly, while Venus is the ruler of the seventh, it's also the almuten of the fifth house. The fifth house is the place that represents kids. So it would be the client's daughter, which is said the fifth house is ruled by Jupiter. So that the most helpful planet in the chart, because it's a helpful planet insect in a way. But also the fifth house almuten, which is the planet that has the most dignity in Pisces during the day. So the co-ruler of the planet's fifth house is Venus. So I think it wasn't me that had the greatest influence, and I think I did some good, but also gave her some medicine that made her physically sick. So definitely a mixed bag. But it was the client's daughter who really sort of stepped in and made some difference. I think looking back at it, the lesson for me, just in terms of treating patients who are very ill, is always go in with gentler medicine than you think. Go much more softly than you think you should be, however dire the circumstance, because you really want to be mindful that these patients have really been through it and their bodies physically can't take anything very strong very often. And then the second point, I think, would be just to, in terms of the astrology, look at that leverage and go, okay, so probably using that Venus and the Jupiter, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, any additional thoughts on this, Ollie? Or
no, I mean, again, it's a fascinating one, and like presumably, they weren't looking for a cure if she had like advanced
no, I mean,
so
they were hoping
to you for help in like alleviating things more.
Yes, they were hoping for, well, I think they were hoping for a cure. They were hoping for everything. But I mean, as I said, they when they came to see me, obviously in that circumstance, most patients understand that it's a very challenging situation. And they'd had all the chemotherapy. They were on, all they could be given was palliative chemotherapy at this point. So I just said, look, I'll do what I can. And our aim will be to extend the quality of life and the length of life as much as we can.
Yes, I mean, and we as herbalists have to be careful about that, particularly in the UK, as we can't.
Yes,
we
cannot claim to cure or even to treat cancer. Indeed. But we can provide complementary treatment for patients who have cancer. So that might sound like double speak, but it just means that if what you're aiming to do is strengthen the patient, enable them, that can be, and very often is, enabling them to tolerate more chemotherapy, or enabling them to sort of get through those harsher treatments. Or if they've come to the end of the line with chemotherapy, or they simply refuse it and don't want to do it, then you can provide treatment to help strengthen their constitution and their immune system. And in that way, and if in so doing you happen to use plants which have some recorded anti-cancer activity, then all to the good,
Absolutely.
So, but you're quite right, you have to be a bit careful. We cannot claim to cure or treat cancer, but we can help patients who have cancer diagnoses. So, all right, so really good. So have you got a chart for us, Ollie?
No, and I think we've kind of
Okay.
run out of time as well, so probably best to go.
Okay. Well,
I'll get a chart for next time on something, so
okay.
or some other
Yeah, yeah.
fascinating
That's
aspect.
fine. Shall I stop sharing? Because we're just looking at a
Oh,
Zoom
that's
screen
better.
now. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we could do another chart, but it's been quite a long one, I think.
I think it's a
So
long one. I think and quite a lot of information as well. So
yes,
best to let
that's
people have a think
true.
about that.
So I think what we should do to balance things out is next, because we wanted to do a little chart on sort of looking at the charts that are flashing red. Maybe if next time you bring a flashing red chart
Yep.
or one chart that, and then to balance it out, we could maybe do a couple of episodes on really positive charts,
Yeah, I
like
think that's
things
a really
where
good idea. I think that's a really good idea, and I've got a couple in mind. I will see which one
okay,
is the clearest, as it were. So I'll do that. Brilliant.
fantastic.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Ollie.
Lovely chatting, Marcos. Thank you.
Likewise, same. All right. See you next week. Bye.